Hello, dragons and discoursers. My name is TBsGuy, and yes, we're going to talk about this. God help me, I am going to talk about this. So, the 2019 Tifa titty tragedy rages on. Driven, as it is of course, mostly by the typical puerile, idiotic screaming on the internet that happens anytime a video game company has the temerity to make a creative decision that threatens someone's boner. Now, I generally don't want to wade into the middle of the ridiculous discourse about creator intent and censorship and all of that nonsense because I don't really think any of it has any merit and isn't really worth discussing. The thing that moved me to do this video in the first place, and I'm sure I will regret it when I see the comment section, is that in all this ridiculous screaming about the bust size of a video game character, I really haven't found anyone seriously engaging with the question of what Tifa's character design is trying to say. Why does she look the way she does? What's the communication there? What's the storytelling? Why the long hair? Why the red eyes? Why the gloves? Why the miniskirt? And indeed, yes, why the boobs? Is there some actual communication going on there related to the themes that Tifa is trying to express in the narrative? Is there some forethought going on here? Or do we just all want to assume that Tetsuya Nomura vomited her onto a piece of paper one day when Hironobu Sakaguchi asked him for a character design for his video game, and nobody ever bothered to think critically about her role in the narrative and just wanted a nice set of tits to be walking around in the video game for no good reason except boners? Anyway, I am somewhat annoyed with this entire state of discourse, as you can probably tell. I'm gonna try to keep myself from ranting, so let's have a serious discussion of Tifa Lockhart as a character design. Anyway, before we do, quick standard disclaimer. Nothing in this video is arguing that sexualization is bad or evil or that having titties in video games is immoral or wrong. We're not having that discussion in this video. We're talking about specifically Tifa Lockhart as a character in Final Fantasy VII, her character design decisions, whether I think they work or not in my particular opinion. You can agree with that, disagree with that, modify my argument, adopt it, do whatever the heck you want. Just please don't go into my comment section to leave a 30-page screed about how the SJW feminist Marxist Illuminati conspiracy is coming for your dick and your video games. Are we cool? Good. So, as we usually do on the channel, we will first discuss the story of the character, the narrative that they're involved with, then we'll take a look at their character design to try and determine, or at least have a discussion about whether their character design is well suited to expressing the themes and ideas that their story is trying to communicate, or whether there's some sort of disconnect there and how that might be explained and what kinds of creative decisions might have led there. Now, summing up the story, the entirety of Final Fantasy VII in short is going to be perhaps a longer video than this one, but taking it very, very briefly with a lot of abbreviation and a few spoilers. Tifa is the childhood friend of the protagonist, Cloud. She's the one who finds him with his entire body and mental state shattered in the slums of Midgard. She's the one who brings him to Avalanche, thus kicking off the entire adventure that the game is centered around. She's a woman who has herself experienced terrifying trauma and emotional damage in her life. Her entire town was burned down right in front of her. Her father was murdered by Sephiroth, and she's developed a tremendous and rather justified hatred of the Shinra company that eventually drives her to join Avalanche, a group of eco-terrorists that are trying to destroy the reactors with which the Shinra company are draining the planet of its life force. In the narrative, Tifa's arc is tied very closely to Cloud's. Generally speaking, she acts as a little bit of a mirror to Cloud's development as a character, where Cloud has to shed his cold, distant, badass loner mercenary persona that he has constructed for himself in order to deal with his trauma. Tifa has to overcome her trauma by shedding her uncertainty and doubt and her worry for the future, and instead beginning to focus on her own capacities as a leader and caretaker. The pivotal moment comes at Cloud's lowest point, where he's been manipulated by Sephiroth into giving up the black materia, thus potentially dooming the entire planet, then tossed into the livestream, had his entire mind shattered by repeated trauma and exposure to Mako energy. It is Tifa and the party who find him at the city of, I think, Midil, where he's washed up with a terrible case of Mako poisoning and a completely shattered personhood and complete inability to even function as a human being. Tifa stays behind to take care of him, and then, through a series of cataclysmic events, both of them are tossed into the live stream, where Tifa is able to access Cloud's subconscious and begin to piece together his memories of who he is as a person and what really happened on that day in Nibelheim when Sephiroth destroyed the entire town. And in so doing, she also has her own memory of those events confirmed. She begins to believe more strongly in her own perception about things, and of course, At the time when Cloud is no longer a member of the party, it is Tifa who takes over as primary party leader. By reconstructing Cloud's character through her empathy, through her kindness, and indeed through her long-standing emotional connection and relationship to Cloud, Tifa comes fully into her own as not only the big sister of the team, but indeed one of the primary leaders of the team and one of the most important characters in the narrative. It is her kindness and empathy, it is her willingness to sacrifice herself for the benefit of others that eventually heals Cloud's emotional scars and allows him to become the hero who can finally put an end to the conflict over the planet. So thematically, Tifa falls into a lot of stereotypical female or feminine roles. That is to say, she's a caretaker, she's an emotional support character, she's someone who deals with the pain and hardship of others around them, helps them heal, helps them put them back on their feet. She's in that sense very maternal, very much like a big sister or a mother figure. Now, there's definitely a critical discussion to be had about the specific ways in which female characters, especially in JRPGs, tend to be turned into accessories to the hero's journeys of the main male characters, which is certainly something that's kind of at play with Tifa, where characters like Barret, Red 13, even frickin' Kate Sith and Cid all have character arcs that are entirely independent of Cloud. Tifa's character arc is tied pretty much at the hip to her primary love interest. This isn't evil or wrong or anything. It's just a story choice that is somewhat cliched and which a lot of people have gotten rather tired of over the years. So, how does all of that interact with her actual design? Well, much like how Tifa takes on some rather stereotypical feminine roles in the story, well, she has a very stereotypically feminine character design. So, long hair, big eyes, earrings, mini skirt, thighs, and long legs, bare midriff, and of course, large anime titty, all of which is interestingly contrasted with some slightly less feminine elements, specifically her big martial arts combat gloves, her suspenders, and her big practical boots. Tifa is, of course, in terms of her class archetype, the monk of Final Fantasy VII. She's the martial arts, she's the one who punches people in the face and kicks them in the groin. And so it makes perfect sense that that element of her character is also represented in her character design. Although, when it comes to the boots specifically, Tetsuya Nomura has always had a thing for footwear. He really does like to put a lot of his characters in implausibly, impractically large shoes and boots. Most notably, of course, in the Kingdom Hearts series, but it does seem to be seeping in already in Final Fantasy VII. Look at all these characters. Everyone is wearing large shoes. Anyway, Tifa displays a mixture of extremely hyper-feminine characteristics interspersed just a little bit with the sensible practicality that her profession requires, which all in all makes her a pretty decent character design. There's good visual storytelling, she's visually distinct from the other female characters in the party, although I do wish there would be a little bit less anime same face. But there's a good mix between design elements that communicate her character and her thematic role in the story, and design elements that communicate her literal function in the gameplay, i.e. the combat system. Which leads us on inevitably to the part of the video that you're actually here for. I managed to stretch it to 8 minutes before actually getting to it. That's pretty impressive. Anyway, let's talk about her boobs. Tifa has big boobs because Tetsuya Nomura felt horny that day and he wanted to put some big anime titty on a character, and there's literally nothing more to it than that. Is one possible answer to the question of why Tifa has the titty that she does. But whether that's actually true or not, I don't really find very interesting. Personally, I just don't find it very interesting to approach a piece of work from the perspective of we need to piece together the puzzle pieces of exactly what the creator intended to be in there. We need to find all the secrets and the hidden meanings. That to me has never been very stimulating. Now, there's a great video about Death of the Author by Lindsay Ellis you can watch in the card up in the corner right now, but for the purposes of this video, no, I don't care if Tetsuya Nomura was just horny that day. I care what the design means to us, more specifically to me, because it's my video and I'm speaking from my perspective right now. Anyway, I think we were talking about anime titties, so Tifa has big boobs because she is the mom of the team. Breasts are a secondary sex characteristic that is typically associated with women, and big breasts in particular have been typically associated with fertility, with womanhood, and especially with motherhood, with nurturing, with caregiving. And as we've already discussed, a lot of Tifa's story is about how she grows through a nurturing relationship with Cloud. As she helps him piece together his identity, she also comes into her own as a leader and a caretaker of the team. She's a surrogate mother to Marlene, who's Barret's daughter. She's a surrogate sister to characters like Aerith, and to a lesser degree Yuffie, who doesn't get to have that many interactions with her. And to Cloud, she's alternately a love interest and a link to his childhood, a link to his innocence and his vulnerability. It is her kindness, empathy, and nurturing spirit that puts Cloud back together in the end, that restores him to some of that lost innocence, that restores him to the person that he was meant to be, and in that sense she takes on a somewhat motherly role towards him. She also tends to be the person who's pushing Cloud to do things like to join Avalanche, to be the leader of the group, to go after Sephiroth, and she's always there kind of encouraging and cheering him on, again taking on that nurturing, encouraging role of the mother. Now, again, there's definitely a serious conversation to be had about the ways in which JRPGs in particular have a tendency to pigeonhole female characters into those kinds of roles, but for the purposes of understanding Tifa as a character design, yeah, I think the big boobs are pretty much being used in one of their most basic connotations, i.e. womanhood, motherhood, caring, nurturing, etc., etc. Now, some of you might be tempted to say, oh well, surely the big boobs are also there as a marketing tactic, right? They're also there, they're there to sell the game, so they can put her on the cover art and say, hey, there's titties in this game, you should buy this game. Presumed 14-year-old boy who doesn't care about anything but tits, and yeah, maybe, but again, that's a creator intent discussion, and I don't really care if they were there as a marketing tool. It's much more interesting to me to talk about how they interact with the character Thematic, which leads us on, of course, to the remake, the source of all this ridiculous controversy, where rather than have the titties ranging free as they were meant to do in nature, Tifa has been squeezed into what turns out to be a sports bra to hold them in place and make them look maybe a little bit smaller so she can do backflips and kickflips and punch people in the groin without worrying about the things flopping out all over the place like this is Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Edition. And beyond just the practical application of course a busty person would use a sports bra, duh, you could make the argument that this design choice has a thematic function. If we accept the reading that Tifa happens to be busty in this character design because it's a visual signifier of her maternity, her motherhood, her nurturing side, her kind side, her empathy, then wouldn't it be a clever little visual bit of storytelling that in order to go into combat, in order to hurt and harm and kill people and creatures in order to protect the people she cares about, she has to repress that nurturing, maternal, motherly side of her. She has to literally bind it up and put it away for a second so that she can engage in violence? Like maybe there's something interesting to discuss there about the juxtaposition of violence against maternal, motherly love, which is something that Final Fantasy VII happens to deal with quite a lot, actually. There's a lot of mother figures in that game. I don't know if you've met Sephiroth and Genova, but even if you think that's kind of a silly, wonky reading and you prefer, like, she just wears a sports bra because that's the only practical thing to do when you're busty and you need to do backflips, the point I'm really trying to get at here is that if you played Final Fantasy VII, if you saw Tifa, traumatized, miserable Tifa whose house and whose village and whose family was burnt to death in front of her eyes, who was nearly killed by a soldier from an evil corporation who joined a group of eco-terrorists in order to try desperately to save the planet from its inevitable demise, who picks up the pieces when the protagonist falls and then eventually puts together the pieces of the protagonist so that he can be a whole person again, whose empathy, kindness, nurturing, and caring is a central pivot around which the entire narrative of Final Fantasy VII ultimately revolves. If you played through that entire story, if you looked at that character's character arc, and the only thing you somehow managed to take away from that is the big anime titty, and you think that is the most important part of the character, the part that they absolutely cannot change, or the whole remake is ruined, then allow me to suggest that you have never actually played Final Fantasy VII. You've sat through it, but you weren't paying any attention. So, if you're out there and you're really upset about Tifa's tits looking slightly smaller in the updated remake, my suggestion to you is this. Go play Final Fantasy VII, go play it, and actually pay attention to it this time. Actually try to engage with the story as a work of art, not just as a piece of fan service. That was one of the angrier videos that I've done in a while, which, well, sometimes you have to. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, then there's a like button down below. You can hit the comment, subscribe, bell icon, all the other YouTube buttons that we constantly tell you to hit because they're literally what keeps channels like mine alive. If you want to help the channel out more directly, well, there's a Patreon for that that's got some rewards. There's like, you can just voting for some things and stuff over there if you want to sign up for a monthly subscription of anything. And if you don't want to do a monthly subscription, well, there's a couple of tip jars down below also where you can give me a one-time tip to say, hey, you talked about Tifa's anime titties for 15 minutes, you should get $3 for that. Well, that's an option as well. As I say at the end of my videos, even $1 in support can mean thousands of views on a video for a content creator. It can be the same as tens of thousands of ad views on a website. So whether it's me or whether it's someone else, if you have an online creator whose work you enjoy, I highly encourage you to support them directly, because even those small $1 donations that don't really feel like anything can make a big difference to people like me. Now, if you haven't enjoyed this video, well, there's a dislike button right down below for your convenience, which you can click on now. But honestly, I hear the remake of the dislike button is finally coming. I know they announced it like 2 years ago now, and we haven't seen anything, but I heard rumors that at next year's E3, they're going to be showing the first screenshots from the remake of the dislike button. And so, like, you have to decide whether you want the dislike button classic experience right now, if you want to wait for the next hardware generation and then experience the dislike button remake. Personally, I have to be honest, I think the classic dislike button is a little bit overrated. Like, I think people have a lot of nostalgia for it, and they kind of overlook the jankier technical aspects of how it was executed back in the day. But if you prefer the classic experience, I'm sure they're going to do an HD remaster sometime down the block, so you don't have to click on the button right now. You could go some other video and click on their dislike button instead of mine, so my stats don't tank. Thank you very much for watching.